we were the warriors. We were the front line in terms of medications, and I always think that had it not been for my timing with that second bout of PCP, I don't even know how I'd lived through 2 bouts of PCP, but if I hadn't lived through that second bout and then gotten on the cocktails, I wouldn't be here to talk to you. Hi, my name is Sean McKenna. Happy to be a part of this project. I'm from Hauppauge, Long Island, but I now live in New York City. I moved here in 1980. Just prior to moving here, I didn't exactly come out, but I had feelings that I was probably gay. The whole musical theater thing, the dominant mother thing, and all that sort of thing. But I didn't really admit it to myself or anybody else until I got here to New York, and I got to New York in 1980. Coming out was not terribly difficult, but you know, back then it was different than it is now. It was risky. You risked losing friends and family. I was fortunate. I had a good circle of friends from Hauppauge that I trusted to tell. There were about 3 or 4 of them. They were all very supportive. I worried about telling my family, but of course they kind of suspected too. My sister knew first. I told my mother when I was dropping her off at the store one day, and she shut the door and turned to me and she said, "Well, are you happy?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, then I can't really say anything." And she seemed to be fine with it, but actually she ended up being worse with it than the rest of my family. My dad found out a couple months later when he and my brother got in a fight, and by then my brother and sister both knew. And my brother told my dad, and he stayed home from work that day and cried all day. And when I came home, he confronted me with the information, and what he was crying about was the fact that he's always the last person to find anything out in the family. Not that, in fact, I was gay, but just why didn't someone tell him when the rest of them found out, which I thought was kind of funny. A couple years later, I had been dating a guy that was considerably older than me. My mother had a problem with me dating guys. I don't get why. I mean, she grew up around gay people, and she didn't. I guess it wasn't good enough for her kid. It was good enough for other people, but not good enough for her kid. And she always didn't want to have grandkids, and I'm the oldest of 3. So I think that kind of shot down one of the chances of her having grandkids, and she didn't like that so much. In time, we came to an agreement. We were fine with it all, but it took us a little while. And in fact, it was my dad who, I had come to New York, I met a photographer. I was a model with Ford models as a kid, and I always looked younger than what I was, so I stayed in the kids department well into me being an adult. And I would go back and forth from the island for jobs, and I went to NYU here for a while. Didn't graduate with anything except like a degree in discotheques, because I got here in 80, and there was Xenon and Studio 54 and all that sort of thing. So it was like overload. I went to gay overload. I wouldn't go past 6th Avenue for the first semester because I knew that would mean that I'd have crossed over into the gay zone, into past 7th Avenue to the West Village, and I wouldn't then be a part of the whole thing, so I kind of avoided it for a long time. In any event, my dad, one Thanksgiving, after I met this photographer who was a good 8, 9 years older than me, which was kind of frowned upon, invited him over for Thanksgiving. It was my dad who actually did the initial inviting and handed out the little peace pipe. But that Thanksgiving was kind of rough because my mom was not completely down with it. I dated him for 8 years. In that 8 years, he ended up getting shingles, which at the time was a precursor to HIV/AIDS, and there was no test at the time, so that pretty much indicated that he was HIV positive. And I was always a germaphobe, and ever since 1982, when Larry Kramer came out with his op-ed piece, I was completely neurotic about sex. So I was always very careful, and always very careful with him, so I always assumed myself to be negative. He went through a lot those 5 years before they had a test, before they had any sort of drugs. I mean, he was one of the first people on AZT, and as a lot of people now know, AZT was killing people faster than it was helping them. He's still alive today in California, in San Francisco, I'm happy to say. But like I said, I always assumed myself to be negative. So I was enjoying New York and discos and all it had to offer, and it was a different New York than it is now. It was The East Village was still the East Village. It wasn't one big dorm for NYU. The West Village was still all kind of rent stabilized, so it was a very creative sort of crowd. It wasn't all rich people. Eventually I moved to the Upper West Side, where I still live in the same rent stabilized apartment, because once you get stuck in a rent stabilized apartment in New York, you're stuck. But I love it there. And let's see. In any event, my lover ended up going through shingles and a number of other HIV-related things, and I was the caretaker. I became the caretaker and learned a lot in that process about him and about AIDS and about HIV. And we ended up separating after 8 years. And by that time, HIV/AIDS was in the full throes of things. So I jumped in and I started working for support groups for Body Positive and for the AIDS Resource Center. And I would run the support groups that were geared toward people who had just found out they were positive at a time when a positive diagnosis meant you were going to die. So actually that's kind of one of my proudest achievements, because I was able to go every week, every Wednesday to those groups and at least make these people feel like they had something to live for, no matter how long it was going to be. And I tend to overlook that in my past. I always forget that I wasn't on the front lines with ACT UP, but I was one of the nurses in the background who did the support groups and helped people through things. And like I said, that's one of my proudest achievements. In any event, one day I went to my doctor. I would get bronchitis every couple of years, and I went to the doctor, and he was actually giving me the prescription. I was putting my coat on. And I said, you know what, just give me the test already. I'm tired of worrying about it. I didn't have any reason. I didn't feel like I was sick or anything like that. And he tested me, and a couple of weeks later, I called for my job, which by that time I was an agent for commercials at a commercial agency. And I called for my job for my results. And I was told that I'd have to see the doctor, because they could tell you you were negative over the phone, but they couldn't tell you were positive over the phone, which made no sense to me, because if they didn't tell you over the phone you were negative, then you knew you were positive. It was supposed to be some sort of like suicide prevention thing, where really it just sent you off into like a whirl of like emotions. You hang up the phone, then you got to wait a week to talk to the doctor about the whole thing. And I was at work, and I hung up the phone. I turned to my coworker and I said, I think I just tested positive for AIDS. And she started to cry. So the first thing I did when I tested positive was console one of my best friends who I worked with. And then I went to the bathroom, and all I remember from that day is the black and white subway tile on the bathroom floor, and me crying in the bathroom for a while, and then getting it back together, going back to work. And for 2 weeks, I just partied it up. I drank, and I went to happy hours, and I thought, what the heck, what have I got to lose at this point? But after about 2 weeks, I thought, no, I could actually be helping people. So I went back to to support groups and that sort of thing, and became a little bit of an activist. But what happened to me was in October of '95, I got PCP pneumonia, and I survived it. And then in February of '96, I got it again, and I just barely survived it. And in March of '96, the protease inhibitors came out. So it's by virtue of a month that I'm probably still here talking to you. I was lucky enough to be able to get on the cocktail as soon as I got out of the hospital. And those first 2 years were horrendous. I mean, it was like you're a guinea pig. They would try, and it wasn't a mean-spirited thing, but they would try anything they could on you, any sort of drug, and this would come through, and let me try this, and let me try that. And most of them had such awful side effects that you actually ended up at home pretty isolated, taking your drugs and feeling crappy. And that stuck with me for about a good decade or so. And then Perry Halkitis, who used to be at NYU, who's now at Rutgers, wrote a book called The AIDS Generation, Stories of Survival and Resilience. And he got together didn't get together, he interviewed 13 positive people, or people with long-term survivors with AIDS, and wanted to know how they got through it. And none of us really had a complete, I mean, most of it was sense of humor. A lot of it was love of other people. For a lot of people it was a pet, but it wasn't anything concrete. And then after interviewing us all separately, he decided maybe we should get them all together. And we all got together, and there wasn't a dry eye in the place because it had been so long since any of us had dealt with our AIDS diagnosis. I mean, we're literally all kind of just making do. Most of us fell into the system in order to be able to receive the benefits that you need to get the drugs. I'm still stuck there, and I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I'd rather have the drugs than money. Money doesn't mean a whole lot, but it did take you away from your career. I mean, I could no longer be an agent, and I always dreamed of being like a Hollywood agent someday. And so it was disappointing and depressing and isolating. And when we all saw each other, we all realized that we had had problems, like whether it be the diarrhea that comes with the meds or headache. I mean, just everything that came with the meds, the soft bones, the kidney problems, and it all came out in this one session. Like I said, we all cried about it, and we're all still friends today. But that clicked something in me, and I realized it had been like 9 or 10 years since anyone had done anything for long-term survivors, and that most of us were in the same sort of a situation. People diagnosed after 96 or in the later 90s and early 2000s had the benefits of better drugs than we did. And we got stuck with the trappings of everything they threw at us during the experimental period. So I thought I have to get back in the game somehow, but I didn't know how to do it. And by then I was on Facebook and AOL and Facebook. You'll find that a lot of long-term survivors, they turn to the internet to reach out to people because it's a very easy way to make groups and get together and not have to worry about leaving the house and wearing a diaper, and which is a very real concern for most HIV-positive AIDS people, even to this day. The big joke whenever I go to anything is they point out the bathrooms before anything starts, so that everyone kind of laughs because that's a big joke. But in any event, I figured I had to get back in the game somehow. And I was on Facebook, and I realized that the GMHC was welcoming back Larry Kramer. And I thought, this is the man who saved my life by forming the GMHC, got kicked out, formed ACT UP, you know, had his own issues, and now they're welcoming him back to the GMHC at a spring gala where the tickets were $600 a piece. And it really enraged me that the people he saved couldn't even afford to look at a ticket, let alone buy one and go see this kind of happy thing happen. So I bitched about it on Facebook, and one of my friends apparently at the time worked for GMHC, and he told the GMHC. So I kept bitching about it because I just thought it was an awful way to treat long-term survivors. I thought if anything, they could have another day where all their long-term survivor clients could get together and they could welcome him back again, do it twice or something. But I wasn't getting anywhere like that, so I just bitched and bitched and bitched. And then finally it got back to the GMHC, and I found myself in front of most of the board at the GMHC, including Kelsey Louie. And my idea was to bring back the buddy program. When the GMHC started, they had the buddy program. It was literally a phone in Roger McFarland's living room. He ran the hotline. Judith Peabody started pairing people up because at the time a lot of families would leave their children when they found out that they had AIDS. So they developed the hotline and the buddy program. They're the first two programs that they developed. And I suggested to them that they bring back the buddy program in a good way, not to help people die, but to help people live, to help people pull them out of their isolation and get them together with other long-term survivors, whether it be groups or whether it be... by then, I knew quite a few people who were homebound because of hip issues or knee issues or the whole soft bone thing and kidneys. And so I really thought there was a need for people to go to these people instead of them coming to the GMHC. It was even difficult for me at the time once in a while to get down there. So fortunately, Kelsey Louie heard me, and a series of 3 years of meetings and figuring out how to work it, and now I'm proud to say that they have the buddy program back, and they've matched 20-some odd buddies, and they still have like another 11 or 12 in the wings, and hopefully those numbers are up a little. They're kind of a little outdated because I found them out like 6 months ago. And I pushed them so hard that they're all actually, they finally saw that until there's a cure, which doesn't look particularly great with our current government, canceling all the NIH funding, that we're all going to be long-term survivors. That if you're going to stay in the business and you're going to work this angle, then you better at some point make some sort of accommodations for long-term survivors, because even the better pills still had people aging quicker than the ones that we were on. On the average, a long-term survivor, according to ACREA, ages 14 years faster than the average person, because HIV is a disease of inflammation. I'm constantly inflamed because I'm constantly fighting off HIV, which is not the case with most people. You get sick, you get inflamed, the inflammation goes away, you have a break. I haven't had a break since I tested positive, and that's the same with other long-term survivors. So we age faster. So I saw a real need for some homebound sort of stuff. And in making these connections with them, I also work with Tom Viola of Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS, who is an angel to anyone who's ever had AIDS in New York City and beyond. They raise so much money and give so much money to so many good causes. I just feel so fortunate to have met him through the whole thing. He's an amazing, amazing man, and I hope he goes down in history as someone very important, if not as important as Larry Kramer, because they never stopped taking care of people with AIDS. The GMHC turned to marriage equality, which I don't have a problem with, but they kind of forgot about us. And then they turned to trans issues, and then they turned to PrEP, and it was always something that usurped long-term survivors. And I feel like now, finally, people are realizing the problems we're having and trying in some way to straighten them out. So not only do they have the buddy program, but they're creating a long-term survivor hub, which they're going to hire a point person so that long-term survivors can go to a point person instead of going through the confusing bureaucracy that you would have to go through to get the help you need at the GMHC. Not that I mean, they have to go through, they have to vet out things, so I understand that there's a process there, but a lot of us have cognitive issues, so as we get older, they just get worse, and things that we did before, like recertifying for benefits and things like that, don't come as easy to us now, even though it's the same freaking form. You second guess yourself and you worry about it, and you're never quite sure. There's this worry that's constantly there. If you're going to get your drugs, if you're going to have your drugs, whether it be the pharmacy holding them up, you don't want to skip a dose. There's things that are unique to long-term survivors that nobody but long-term survivors understand. And I don't expect people to understand those things, but I do expect people to have empathy for the people who fought the hardest in the war on AIDS, just by being there and allowing ourselves to be guinea pigs and sticking it out. I can't say that I don't suffer isolation and depression like every other long-term survivor on a regular basis because of the things that were taken from us, but I'm trying to make the best life I can with what I have, and I'm proud of what I've done, and I'm actually very proud to be a long-term survivor and to be here. What would I say to somebody who just found out they were HIV positive is adherence. It's the first thing I always say. And I even say this to people on PrEP, that if you're going to take PrEP, you have to stick to your drug schedule or it's not going to work the right way. And something like that can be a complete disaster. You're going to be fine. You have it better than we did. Your health is going to be okay. You're going to live. You're going to plan on living. Unlike us who at the time were told we were going to die, you're going to live. So plan on it. Plan on being here for a long time. Plan on making your life what you want it to be. And again, practice empathy. I mean, just because we're in this situation doesn't mean other people don't have their problems. I'm Sean McKenna, and I'm a long-term survivor, and I'm happy to still be alive. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to have learned through all my experiences that love is the most important thing any of us can do for one another.